America's Evil Genius back with you once again, and coming off last week in Iowa and Rick Santorum. Well, I almost said Rick Santorum's win in Iowa. I guess technically speaking it wasn't. Santorum came in second by 8 votes to Mitt Romney, so it feels like a win. It seems like a win. I guess technically it wasn't, but then again, when you really think about it, you know, Mitt Romney spent millions of dollars to win by 8 votes, and Rick Santorum spent a fraction of that and took his campaign from being on virtual life support to now being the next up-and-coming campaign to challenge Mitt Romney. And if you look at it at the end of the week, it's Mitt Romney's campaign that's on the defensive and Rick Santorum's that's on the offensive, so you tell me who won. In a practical sense, I guess Rick Santorum did win it. But nevertheless, since that happened, the media has been up in arms. And yeah, you know, they always get up in arms whenever a new Republican candidate emerges in this race. But it's been particularly vitriolic this week in terms of Rick Santorum. I mean, the press have been all over the board saying, oh, there's no way you can nominate Rick Santorum. There's no way he can win. He's just behind the times, what with all his religion and everything else. And every criticism you hear about Rick Santorum centers around his viewpoints on social policy and his viewpoints on the traditional family, and yes, his viewpoints on religion. They criticize the fact that his religious views, he's a strong Catholic, that his religious views are an influence on his policy, his social policy, tradition, you know, definition of marriage, that kind of thing. And that's just something that, by golly, the left-wing media, they just won't abide by that. By golly, they just got to let us know how wrong it is that someone like that is in the race. And it almost seems like they're trying to convince us that someone with Santorum's viewpoints, that evil religious guy that he is, that someone with his viewpoints just ought to be disqualified from the race altogether. He shouldn't even be in the thing. Well, I think there's a lot of the American people that disagree with you, O media. But they're really criticizing him for his re-emphasis on the traditional American family, doing so because they feel it's something that he derives from his religious beliefs. And I'm sure it is. I'm sure that's a large part of it. But, you know, once you look past that, and you really look at where our nation is at right now, even if you set aside the religious side of it, you would have to think that Santorum's onto something in terms of using the re-emphasis of the American family as a way to start tackling our biggest problems. You know, back in the Bloomberg debate a few months ago, and I've shown this clip on this show previously, Santorum came up with one of the absolute best answers I've ever heard in terms of explaining a lot of the poverty in America and a lot of the problems we have in America, a lot of the crime, that sort of thing. And it didn't really get much attention at the time because, as I say, Santorum at that point was on the fringes of the GOP race, but now he's right in the middle of it, and his ideas are going to get looked at again. And I think we should go back to that Bloomberg debate and look once again at Santorum's viewpoint on what is causing a lot of the problems in America today. Roll it.
It's out of time. I want to give you a chance, and then we have to go to the final question.
There's more to it than that. I agree with Rick, what he said. But the biggest problem with poverty in America, we don't talk about here because it's an economic discussion, and that is the breakdown of the American family. You want to look at the poverty rate among families that have a husband and wife working in them? It's 5% today. A family that's headed by one person, it's 30% today. We need to do something. We need to talk about economics. The home, the word home in Greek is the basis of the word economy. It is the foundation of our country. We need to have a policy that supports families, that encourages marriage, that has fathers take responsibility for their children. You can't have limited government. You can't have a wealthy society if the family breaks down that basic unit of society, and that needs to be included in this economic.
All right.
Well, that made an awful lot of sense. Now, granted, it was glossed over at the time, and everybody was focusing on other things, you know, Herman Cain and Mitt Romney and everything else. So that soundbite sort of came and went without much fanfare or much attention. I wish he would say something very similar today because it would get attention now because he's the guy that the spotlight's on. But I think he was absolutely right. And I know there's a lot of people out there that are very uncomfortable with someone with a strong religious viewpoint making public policy. But I would argue that if you set aside the religious aspect of this, not that I want to do that, but for sake of discussion, let's say you're an atheist, let's say you're a non-Christian, let's say you belong to some fly-by-night non-Christian religion. That's all well and good. That's perfectly legal. If you're one of those people, I would argue that even setting the religious aspect of all of this aside, I would argue that the re-emphasis of the traditional American family, the advocacy of the traditional male, female, married household raising children, that the advocacy of that is one of the best ways to start getting our country back to the right place in terms of poverty and crime and those sorts of things. I would tell you that because we have abandoned that idea largely over the last 100 years, that we have contributed greatly to a lot of the problems that we see today. I'm not alone in making that statement. There's a lot of research out there that backs me up on it. A lot of articles, a lot of research that will tell you exactly the same thing. Let's look at a few different places where this idea is reinforced, that the traditional American family is, far and away, the best possible environment to raise children in. Let's start with the Telegraph UK from an article back on January 3rd of this year. Article entitled, "Boys Raised by Traditional Families Do Better at School." And I'm going to quote a couple of things out of this article. Quoting from the Telegraph here. "Researchers in the United States tested various theories to explain bad behavior and low standards among boys and concluded that home-based influences played a much bigger part than biological differences, the style of early education, teacher gender, or peer pressure. Boys' likelihood to act out is sharply reduced when faced with larger and better parental inputs," said the study. "As these parental inputs are typically higher and of better quality in intact families, this largely contributes to why boys with single mothers are so much more disruptive and eventually face school suspension." And the article goes on to say that the study found that indiscipline reduced among boys brought up by two parents and increased sharply among those raised by single mothers. First of all, I love that word, indiscipline. You know you're reading an article from the United Kingdom. You know you're reading something out of England when you see a word like indiscipline. I don't think that type of word exists in America. That's a totally off-topic sort of thing. But nevertheless, an article there that shows that the two-parent, stable, married, male-female household is much preferable to a single-parent household or a non-related household in the raising of children. Here's another bit of proof. This one from USA Today, article from November 17th, 2007, article entitled, "Abuse More of a Risk in Non-Traditional Families." Quoting once again, "This is the dark underbelly of cohabitation," said Brad Wilcox, a sociology professor at the University of Virginia. "Cohabitation has become quite common, and most people think, what's the harm? The harm is we're increasing a pattern of relationships that's not good for children." So cohabitation, even the, hey, we're not married but we're shacking up, or we're not married but my boyfriend or girlfriend of the week lives in the house with us. That's not a good thing according to this sociology professor. And this article in USA Today goes on a little bit further to illustrate some statistics that you might wish to be aware of the next time that someone advocates to you that a single-parent household is just as good as a traditional household, or a gay household is just as good as a traditional household. Try these on for size. Children living in households with unrelated adults are nearly 50 times, 50 times, as likely to die of inflicted injuries as children living with two biological parents, according to a study of Missouri abuse reports published in the Journal of the American Academy of Pediatrics in 2005. I'm sorry, I should really correct my pronunciation there. A study of Missouri abuse reports. I mean, I'm from the state of Missouri. The proper pronunciation is Missouri, but I've been around these Yankees in the St. Louis area too long. Sometimes I mispronounce the name of the state. But still, that's a pretty damning statistic. 50 times as likely to die of inflicted injuries. Wow. It goes on. Children living in step families or with single parents are at higher risk of physical or sexual assault than children living with two biological or adoptive parents, according to several studies co-authored by David Finkelhor, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, David Finkelhor, director of the University of New Hampshire's Crimes Against Children Research Center. And finally, girls whose parents divorce are at significantly higher risk of sexual assault whether they live with their mother or their father, according to research by Robin Wilson, a family law professor at Washington and Lee University. But wait, there's more. From the Mail Online, dated December 16, 2008, 1 in 4 British children living in poverty due to breakdown of traditional families. And then finally, a policy brief from the Institute for Marriage and Public Policy, dated September 21st, 2005, quoting, "In a review of 23 recent U.S. studies published in peer-reviewed journals between 2000 and June 2005, all but 3 found some family structure effects on crime or delinquency. Married parents appear to reduce both the individual risk and the overall rates of crime. That is, recent research strongly suggests that both young adults and teens raised in single-parent homes are more likely to commit crimes, and that communities with high rates of family fragmentation, especially unwed childbearing, suffer higher crime rates as a result." And if you want some proof on that, I double dog dare you to get into your car and go down to your nearest inner city after dark. Please lock your doors, it's for your own good, and just take a look around you, and you will see that what they say there is correct. So the evidence is overwhelming. The evidence is overwhelming. The traditional two-parent household is far and away the best possible environment in which to raise children. Now, is it perfect? No, nothing is. Nothing's guaranteed in life. Does that mean that a child coming out of a stable two-parent, married, male-female household will automatically be successful? No, of course not. But it does mean that that child would have the highest possible likelihood of success. Likewise, does that mean that a child out of a single-parent household or other non-traditional setup, does that mean that child would automatically be unsuccessful or automatically be a criminal? No, but it tells you that that child has a much lower likelihood of success. And that perhaps we as a society should make our decisions in child rearing accordingly. Think about it. It's like a game of poker. Any of you who have played poker, if you've watched poker on TV, and let's face it, in the last few years, how could you have avoided poker on TV? I think there's one ESPN channel that shows like 18 hours of poker a day, so you have to be familiar with it to some level by now. In a typical game of Texas Hold'em, pocket aces are the best possible starting hand you can be dealt. Pretty common knowledge. Everybody knows pocket aces, the pocket rockets here, best possible hand you can be dealt in a game of Texas Hold'em. And if you're dealt this hand, that means you have the highest likelihood from that point of winning the hand. It's not a guarantee that you'll win the hand. Everybody's lost with pocket aces at some point, so have I. But still, it's the best possible hand you can start with. You always look forward to seeing these little babies when you're playing a game of poker. On the other hand, the worst possible hand in poker is 7-2. Good old 7 deuce. Worst possible hand. You don't want to play this hand. However, it's not guaranteed that you'll lose the hand if you play it. You could potentially win a hand with 7 deuce. But the likelihood is that you won't. So the bottom line is, you don't want to play 7 deuce any more than you have to. I never play it unless I'm in the small or big blind. You want to play things like pocket aces and hands closer to that as much as possible, and crap like 7 deuce, you want to chuck it. You don't want to play it. It'll do you no good. Even though, in theory, you could win with it, you want to stay as far away from that kind of hand as possible. Likewise, with raising children, we know, by just what I told you, we know, setting aside all the religious aspects, we know that a two-parent, stable, married household is the best way to raise children, and that anything else is far and away an environment that is much less likely to lead to the success of that child. Now, as I said earlier, you can set all the religious stuff aside. I would rather you not. I think that the religious aspects of this are a pretty good reason to follow it, but if you don't, that's okay. But I think you can still be in favor of the reintroduction of the American family, the traditional American family, to American society. I don't see how you can ignore it. I don't see how you can oppose it. I don't see at this point how you can continue to say, all sorts of family structures can be successful. We need to be open and tolerant of all views of the American family. I just proved to you that that's hogwash. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not telling you that parents who are in these non-traditional households are bad people or incapable of raising kids, anything like that. I'm not going that far. I have no doubt that there are single mothers, single fathers, even cohabitating people raising kids, even, dare I say it, gay couples. I'm sure there are people out there in those groups who are good people at heart. I'm sure there are people in those groups who have the best interest of their children at heart. I'm not doubting that. I'm sure there are people in those groups who are doing their dead level best to bring up their children as best they can. But the bottom line is they have put themselves and their children in a situation where achieving that goal is significantly less likely. Therefore, we as a society, if we care about crime and poverty and all of those other things, if we're going to fight those things, we must start at the level of fixing the American family. And that's what Rick Santorum wants to do. That's all he wants to do. If you're not comfortable looking at it through a religious lens, fine. Don't look at it through a religious lens. Look at it through a lens of what works and what doesn't work. You know, for the past 100 years, America has abandoned an awful lot of what we've learned over the generations and over the centuries about the raising of children and of how to create citizens, how to build citizens. And we've abandoned that because people tell us, oh, those are religious views and they're outdated. Well, yes, those type of views do have something in common with the Judeo-Christian ethic, no question about it. But those views also stem, in addition to stemming from Judeo-Christian ethic, it also stems from the collected experience that we as a civilization have, that we've handed down from generation to generation, from century to century, of knowing what works and what doesn't work. And we hand that down to the future generations and they build upon it. But it's been this recent couple of generations that have spat in the face of all that and turned their back on it and said, you know what? All of those things that the thousands of years of human history have taught us, let's abandon it all because we just don't like it. Because it's too constrictive, it's too restrictive on us. You know, sometimes I think America as a culture is in that same position as that sad person you see ever so often that might be in their late 20s or early 30s and spent their teens and their early 20s as a rebellious person, rebelling against what their parents taught them and their grandparents taught them and what religion taught them. And they went out and they partied and they, you know, maybe they got into drugs, maybe they got into alcohol, maybe they got into libertine sexual practices. And they look up once they're in their late 20s or their early 30s, if they're lucky enough to be alive, and they find that their life is a shambles and that they don't have the skills they need to exist in a constructive and productive way in society. Maybe they have a drug addiction they're trying to lick. Maybe they have a venereal disease or two that they have to deal with. Maybe they have a child or two out of wedlock that they're trying to raise and struggling to do so. And all because they rebelled against what they were taught. And all because they rebelled against what deep down they knew was right all along. But they just didn't like it. They were taught the right things, but they abandoned it because it would be more fun to chase the sins of the flesh or the drugs or whatever else it was they were chasing. I think America as a culture is very much like that. We've spent the last 100 years trying to have all the fun and take none of the responsibility. We've abandoned those square ideas of our grandparents and great-grandparents and generations before them who knew the right way to do things and taught us that, but we just didn't like the fact that, well, we'd have to take responsibility. I'd rather go out there and party, and I'd rather go out there and do some drugs, and I'd rather go out there and drink, and I'd rather go out there and have sexual liaisons. And damn the consequences, eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow you may die. Well, eventually, you wake up and realize that your life is in a shambles. And that's where America's at right now. And you have a choice at that point. Do you pick yourself up by the bootstraps and start living life the right way and start trying to put the pieces back together? Or do you say, to heck with it? I'm just going to live this way until I die, whether that's tomorrow or next year or whenever. I've already blown it. That's the decision that America has in 2012. Are we going to continue to follow the destructive path that we were on during the 20th century? Are we going to follow the destructive path of just buying whatever we want to without paying for it? Give us free health care, give us free welfare, give us free whatever, as long as we don't have to take any responsibility. Let us sleep around with whoever we want to and not have to raise the children. Or are we going to mature up? Are we going to wake up and be mature human beings and say, you know what? Look in the mirror, be man enough to look in the mirror, look ourselves in the eye and say, you know what? We screwed up and it's time to fix it. I vote for the latter. And that's why I'm happy that Rick Santorum has started to emerge in this race. Even if you're not on board with him religiously, which I think you should be, but even if you're not, he understands that repairing the American family is the key to dealing with our issues of poverty, dealing with our issues of crime, and dealing with our issues of societal breakdown. If you don't do that, if you don't address the American family problems, then I don't care what kind of fiscal plan you have, it will not work. I don't care what kind of plan on crime you have, it will not work. I don't care what you want to do in terms of fixing the inner cities, it will not work until we fix the American family. Several months ago, I did a show talking about why blacks and African Americans should abandon the Democratic Party. And in that show, if you saw it, I gave you a lot of research from Dr. Thomas Sowell and from Walter E. Williams that showed many of the problems in the African American communities were directly related to the breakdown of the family in those communities. Something that I feel was encouraged by the government largely, but that's neither here nor there. The bottom line is, when the family broke down in the African American community, that's when all hell broke loose. And I'm telling you now, it's about to happen in the rest of America. Rick Santorum is trying to stop it before it does. And I think you should join him. That's it for this week. This is America's Evil Genius. We'll see you next week.